The stone corridors of the Plantagenet court still echo with footsteps of shame. Long after the boots have rotted, the crown has rusted, and the bloodlines vanished into dust. He was not a warrior, not a reformer, not a ruler remembered for his vision or victories. But his name? It stinks through history. A king who cared more for flesh than justice, who treated noblemen like cattle and their wives like toys, who turned power into an appetite into cruelty. His chamber was England's true court, and the sentences he passed were not written in ink. They were moaned into pillows, screened in shame, buried in stillborn children. This was not some dark medieval rumor. It was a system, a pattern. A monarchy infected by lust, the lords knew they could lose their wives to his gaze. The queens knew they were tools for treaties. The people knew they had no king, only a wolf in ermine robes. Today, we strip away the veil of ceremony. We name. What history dared not. Edward II was not just weak. He was not just incompetent. He was a predator, cloaked in divine right. This is the story of the most hated king in England's long and violent history, a man who broke every oath except one, to please himself. The candles had already begun to drip before the crown touched his head. Not with reverence, but with dread, the hall was filled, and yet silence clung like smoke. Thick, metallic, unnatural. Even the stained glass seemed to flinch. It's colored. Light falling shy of the altar, as if unwilling to witness what was about to happen. Edward sat too casually for a king. His eyes wandered, not toward his bride, nor toward the cross, but toward a man dressed too fine for his station. Piers Gaveston, draped in silks that whispered arrogance, standing too close, smiling too wide. No one missed the glance. Number. One forgot it. It was a coronation by law, but a seduction by will. As the oil anointed his forehead, it was not sacredness he wore. It was entitlement, layered in velvet and layered deeper in desire. Even the priests sensed it. The hand that should have trembled with the weight of duty instead curled with private satisfaction. His wife, Isabella, still only a girl, stood beside him like cold marble, regal, untouched, unwelcomed. A French princess meant to bind two nations. But here, at her wedding mass, she was already discarded. The first pawn swept off the board before the game began. The nobles muttered. Their mouths didn't move, but their eyes were loud. They had fought, bribed, and bled to be near the throne. And yet here stood a foreign-born favorite smirking beside the new king, wearing jewels gifted by the crown, stroking the air with the arrogance of a lover certain of his place. The crown was not heavy enough. Edward wore it like a costume, not a burden. He paraded it through the halls with Gaveston trailing behind like a shadow dressed in perfume. The coronation was followed by feasts, but not for unity, for display. The choicest meat went to Gaveston, the seat of honor, the smile of the king. And all the while, Isabella sat in silence, her gaze fixed downward, her lips folded into themselves, like she feared the sound of her own breath. No king had ever insulted his court with such open defiance. No monarch had ever draped his favorite in titles meant for war heroes and old blood. And yet Edward did so with glee, as if daring the realm to protest. They didn't, not yet. They watched. They gnashed teeth in private rooms. They rewrote wills. They whispered to priests. Because they saw it now, not the coronation of a king, but the enthronement of desire. Edward had not ascended, he had unveiled. And once unmasked, he did not blink. He leaned into it. He called Gaveston brother. He made him earl. He gave him estates that belonged to dead heroes, to widows of loyal knights. It was theft by velvet, plunder not of gold, but of dignity. And it began not in some late-hour scandal, but here, in the most sacred moment of kingship, His coronation. There was no turning point, because he never intended to turn. The people felt it in their bones, that something had broken in the ritual, that the old threads of loyalty, of divine right and sacred duty had been rewoven into something obscene. This wasn't the age-old dance of power and vice. This was something darker. A courtship between king and court jester where everyone else was made to kneel. Even the air around Edward felt warmer, not with holiness, but with breath, as if the throne room pulsed with secret lungs, exhaling lust, inhaling obedience. The queen became a statue, the nobles became props, the favorite became flame, and Edward? He became what he always was beneath the crown. A boy who mistook love for possession and duty for pleasure. From this beginning, nothing noble could grow. Only rot, even the crown, passed from blood to blood for generations, seemed to dull under. His reign, no longer a symbol of honor, but a circlet slicked in oil, sweat, and whispered shame. This was not an accident. This was the beginning. A kingdom can suffer cruelty. It can weather war, but when the rituals themselves are corrupted, when the crown is used not to serve, but to seduce, there is no sanctity left to bleed for. And in that silence, deep beneath the hymns, the realm understood. Edward was not just king, he was his own altar, and all of England would soon be made to kneel. It began in whispers, not the kind that drift between lovers, but the colder ones that curdle at court, sliding behind tapestries, beneath robes, between clenched jaws. Something had ruptured, not with swords, but silks. Piers Gaveston was number general, no bishop, no blood heir. He was born to nothing and dressed like a prince. His steps echoed too loud on the marble floors, his laughter too shrill beneath cathedral ceilings. He touched the king's shoulder too often. He sat where others bowed, and he smiled as if England already belonged to him. Edward did not hide it. He paraded his favorite like a jewel. He mocked those who winced, exalted the man who had once polished his armor. The crown was shared not with the queen, but with a man whose fingers smelled of perfume and power. A man who wore crimson when others bled for it. Isabella, the queen, learned early that silence was safer than pride. She stood still as her. Dowry was mocked. She smiled as her hand was ignored. She bowed as her crown was passed. Not to her, but to him. The palace corridors turned cold. Not from winter, but from absence. The queen's presence was no longer requested. She was spoken of as one might mention a statue, a fixture, not a force. She slept in rooms where candles were never lit. She woke to linens folded by hands that never met her gaze. And yet, Bethune, favorite's name was everywhere. Gaveston, 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 carved into toasts, woven into gossip, written into titles he had not earned. He was called the king's brother, but no blood linked them. He was called the king's joy. And that, perhaps, was the only truth. Isabella's humiliation was not loud, was not public, but it was constant. She became a mirror, polished, poised, and unseen. Her letters home grew shorter, her prayers longer. She pressed her palms together so tightly her fingers bruised. Still, the court moved without her, like a dance she was forced to watch from behind locked doors. And the nobles, they watched too, men whose fathers had died for the realm, knights who bore scars like medals, earls with dynasties stitched into every inch of their robes. They were forced to bend to a man who had done nothing but catch the king's gaze and never look away. Gaveston mocked them in French. He mimicked their accents, insulted their titles, adorned himself with jewels meant for war heroes. And Edward laughed until his voice echoed down the corridors like mockery in flesh. At banquets, the king placed his favorite beside him. Not the queen, never the queen. At council, Gaveston interrupted with jokes. When land was divided, his name appeared first. When power was questioned, his presence answered it. It was not just insult. It was invasion, of protocol, of lineage, of order, and yet no one moved because Edward was king, because to strike at the favorite was to strike at the throne, and to strike at the throne was to vanish. So they waited in silence, in chambers filled with whispers. In churches where nobles knelt beside warriors they hated, they waited for the queen to break, but she didn't. She wore her sorrow like a second skin. She held her tongue as her husband gifted estates to a lover. She watched, wordless, as her position shrank with every favor bestowed on another. But inside her, something coiled. Not revenge, not yet, but memory. She remembered the court of France, where kings at least pretended to love their queens. She remembered her father's warnings, whispered into her braid the night she left. A crown is not a shelter, it is a weight. And if your husband does not lift it with you, you will drown beneath it. And so she drowned, slowly, not in water, but in silk, the silk of gowns she wore to rooms where she was invisible, the silk of letters from home that carried no answers, the silk of sheets untouched by the man who ruled her body, but never touched her soul, and through it all, the kingdom trembled, because a queen humiliated is not just a woman scorned. She is a mirror cracked, a promise broken, a storm held behind lips for too long, and a court that forgets its queen for a man with. Perfume and power has already signed its own sentence. They did not know it yet, but something had shifted, not with rebellion, but with watching, because sometimes fury grows quiet, it grows dressed in velvet. It grows behind folded hands, and when it breaks, it doesn't knock, it burns. The scent of burning parchment lingered in the corridors, not from war, not from rebellion, but from edicts inked with cruelty, sealed with wax that never cooled. Decrees signed in candlelight, while women slept in beds no longer theirs, beneath roofs no longer safe. Gaveston had died with a scream that faded into gravel, dragged from royal favor to a traitor's death. But even in absence, his shadow remained. It shaped the void. It taught Edward how power could be used not only to shame, but to punish. Into that emptiness stepped a colder man, Hugh Despenser, not laughing, not charming, sharp where Gaveston was soft, silent where Gaveston sang. But the hunger was the same. Maybe worse, because Despenser did not want the king's affection. He wanted his leash, and Edward gave it. The court changed its posture. The air thickened. Nobles who once whispered in corners now looked at each other with empty faces, masks of obedience over broken teeth. The queen, once dismissed, now watched from stillness, her fury frozen by what came next. They came for the lands first, letters delivered at dawn, seals that bled red onto the names of noble families, as if guilt oozed through the cracks in old stone walls. Accusations of treason, heresy, defiance, whatever word was needed to justify the theft. And always, somehow, the outcome was this same: a husband imprisoned, a manor seized, a woman alone. And then the doors opened. Despenser did not love them. Edward did not woo them. There were no flowers, no sonnets, no soft words beneath balconies. There was only law. And behind that law, appetite. They called it wardship. They called it custody. They called it justice. But the women knew. Their eyes carried it. The chill in their limbs told them the truth. They had been handed over like parchment, touched like land, broken like horses. Their husbands screamed from dungeons. Their sons were taken as wards of the crown, and they noble, once regal, were told to curtsy before the man who had destroyed everything they were. Silk was torn from their backs. Hair was brushed too gently before it was pulled. Candles were lit only to watch them flinch in firelight, and in the silence after, when no hand reached to comfort, When the sheets grew cold with sweat and silence, they were told to sign confessions, compromises, alliances sealed with trembling fingers. If they refused, they were accused. If they obeyed, they were used. There was no path through the thorns. Only the slow bleed. Their names faded from record, replaced by titles they did not choose: Lady of Nothing, Widow of the Living, Trader's Wife. Their children were raised under foreign hands. Their bodies remembered the weight of fingers that smelled like royal ink. Their dreams no longer came with faces, only walls, stone, echoing forever, and Spencer grew rich. His estates multiplied. His enemies disappeared. He became the king's mouth, his hand, his shadow. And Edward, like a man whose soul had rotted, but whose crown remained, watched it all with the gaze of a butcher who had forgotten animals once screamed. He called it discipline. He called it loyalty. But it was something deeper, the pleasure of control, the intoxication of pain delivered without blood, the unspoken thrill of watching others fall, not by sword, but by silence. The queen watched from the far end of the court. She saw the women vanish. She saw titles handed to dispenser like wine. She saw loyalty die in the eyes of every nobleman, who still wore a chain of fealty around his neck, and she waited because what they called justice was a disease. And she had learned its symptoms well. In Edward's England, desire was law, and punishment wore perfume. He did not need to sleep with their wives. He needed only to take them, to make it legal, to make it royal, and the worst part, the realm allowed it, because power dressed in ritual becomes harder to name. Because when a crown says it's lawful, even rape begins to sound like a hymn. But the women knew, and the walls remember, because no scream, once uttered in velvet, ever truly disappears. Just echoes and waits. She left England not in chains, but in shadow. No guards forced her from court. No sentence exiled her name. Yet every step away from Edward was a kind of funeral. For a queen, for a wife, for a woman, the world was taught to forget. The sea, crossing to France, was cold. Salt air stung the edges of her eyes, but she did not blink. In the quiet belly of the ship, she did not pray. She did not sleep. She sat wrapped in furs that no longer smelled of royalty, only survival. England had taken everything but her spine. Edward had made her into an echo, a consort without court, a queen without power. He had slept with her enemies, then knighted them. He had humiliated her in public, stolen her dowry, and handed her dignity to the dispensers like a discarded trinket. But in exiling her, he had made one fatal error. He gave her space, and in that space, something ancient grew. In France, she did not hide. She watched. She studied court from the corners, listened through veils, learned the price of silence and how to shatter it. And then she met him, Roger Mortimer, a fugitive in name, a noble in blood, and something more in his eyes. Not love, not yet, but recognition. A man also exiled, also wounded, also seething there. Alliance was not romantic. It was alchemical. Grief met fire. Fury met form. And together they sharpened. Her letters to Edward stopped. Her silence thickened. The mask cracked. And beneath it was not the grieving wife, but the architect. They moved like ghosts across Europe, gathering support not with banners, but with promises. Coins were whispered into pockets, swords drawn behind cloaks. Men who had once toasted Edward now licked their lips at the thought of his fall. She wore black in those months, not for mourning, but for memory. And when the time came to return, she did not sail as a queen. She returned as the storm. The invasion was not grand. There were no blaring horns, no poetic speeches. Just the wet thud of boots on English soil, the hum of breath in armor, and the bitter wind of October clawing at the sails. With Mortimer beside her, she landed not like a conqueror, but like something long buried, now risen. Villages did not resist. Towns did not bar their gates. Edward had ruled too long with greed, too long with shadow. The people remembered the women who had vanished, the men who had been broken, the queen who had been silenced. And they opened their door. Her army was not large. It didn't need to be. Every step forward was fueled by old betrayal, every mile soaked in memory. And as she marched, the court began to crack. The dispensers fled first, scrambling like roaches under overturned gold. Edward followed, stumbling through fields, trying to wear the crown like armor, but finding it heavy with shame. His power dissolved not in battle, but in breath. Nobles defected. Allies vanished. The throne stood a lone dot, and then they found him, trapped, trembling, clothed in royal blue like it could still save him. Eyes sunken, lips dry. He tried to speak, but the words fell limp. There was no rebellion left to crush, no war to win. Just reckoning, Isabella did not spit. She did not strike. She did not scream. She looked at him, long enough for silence to weigh heavier than iron. This was the man who had stripped her of voice, of flesh, of position, who had held power like a blade to her neck, year after year, who had watched her walk away and never followed. Now he was nothing, and she did not need to say it. Mortimer did not smile. His sword remained sheathed. Vengeance, when ripened, does not rage. It chills. Edward was taken in chains. The dispensers not even allowed that dignity. One was flayed, another hung, another dragged through streets until he wept blood into the mud. The realm that once feared Edward now applauded his fall with quiet teeth. But Isabella, she remained still. Her revenge was not their pain. It was her presence, to return, to command, to rule, not beside a king, but in place of one. She took no pleasure in the executions. She lit no fires herself, but she watched them burn, and in the glow, she remembered every locked door, every title stolen, every night she prayed for absence. Those prayers had been answered, because power is not always taken by men with swords. Sometimes it is reclaimed by women who remember. She did not cry. She did not kneel. And England, for the for first time, bent. The rain had softened the earth by the time they brought him in. Not heavy, not violent, just the quiet, persistent kind that drowns sound. It soaked the leather of his boots, turned the path to the tower into sludge. He didn't resist. Resistance requires belief, and Edward had lost that long ago. His cloak dragged behind him like regret. The cell was small, but not filthy. There was no need for filth when shame does the same work. A narrow window carved in stone let in a sliver of light. Dust danced in it like ghosts with nowhere else to go. The air was still, not heavy, not cold, but emptied like something. Sacred had been ripped out long ago, and nothing dared to return. He didn't scream. He didn't weep. He just sat, the king, once draped in ermine and silk, now wrapped in rough wool that scratched the skin. His hands were no longer kissed. His name no longer bowed to. He was Edward only to the men who opened the iron door and looked without blinking. They didn't speak to him, not out of pity, but because nothing he said mattered anymore. And so, the silence grew. Days blurred into a dull rhythm of gruel and straw. No trial, no final words, just breath, shallow and slowing. The man who once summoned armies now counted rats in the corners, flinching at every footstep because he didn't know which would be the last. And then, one night, they came, two men, faces half lit, not masked. They didn't need to hide. History would forget them. That was the point. He was held down, not harshly, just firmly, like a child being quieted. What happened in that room will never be written cleanly. The chronicles smudge it. The priests avoided it. Even whispers lost their shape trying to form it. Some say it was a knife. Others say it was something worse, something designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to burn the very part of him that had once burned others, to destroy the body that had stolen so many, to answer cruelty not with steel, but with fire. And silence. There are no official witnesses. Only echoes, a scream, they say, high and sudden, then gone. A sound so sharp that the birds in the tower did not sing for 3 days. When they found him, his face was cold, not twisted in pain, but slack, as if he had exhaled and forgotten to draw breath again. There was no blood on the walls, no wounds that would satisfy vengeance, just a stillness so deep it made the guards step back. They wrapped the body in linen and kept the face covered. The realm was informed, not with sorrow, not with fanfare. Just a message, clean, dry, unceremonious. The king was dead, and no one mourned him. The court didn't wear black. The bells didn't toll with any urgency. The people, those who had watched their daughters taken, their lords disgraced, their queen discarded, nodded in silence. Some even smiled, not from joy, but from relief. The weight had lifted, not just of tyranny, but of shame. Edward II had not died a martyr. He had not died a warrior. He had died as he lived, stripped of dignity, clinging to power long after it. Had let go of him, and yet there was no comfort in it, no triumph in the end, because cruelty, even deserved, leaves a stain. The manner of his death, so quiet, so veiled in dread, whispered something England didn't want to hear. That even monsters bleed. That even those who destroy can die with no audience. That justice, when stretched too far, begins to resemble vengeance. The crown passed. The court shifted. But the echo of that scream, whether it happened or not, lingered. It clung to the stone. It haunted the silence. It stained the throne, even after it had been polished clean. Because when a man is hated enough to die in the darkness does not die with him. The tomb lies quiet now, carved in stone, veiled in Latin, brushed by the cold light that spills through cathedral glass. No one weeps there. No prayers linger in the air. Only silence, old, resigned, exhausted. Here lies Edward, once called king. Time has been kind to his corpse. The marble is clean. The crown etched above his name remains uncracked. No hint of the hands that once held women like property. No trace of the screams swallowed by palace walls. Just stillness, dignified, deceptive. That is how power survives, not through glory. Through forgetting, they wrote him into records as unfortunate, misguided, a man too enamored with bad companions. They blamed the favorites, Gaveston the spoiled, Spencer the cruel, as if Edward had been helpless, as if a crown could be worn without responsibility, as if sin could be outsourced. The truth was harder. So they softened it. The women who vanished from court, who were touched without consent and buried without name, they do not rest in marble. Their bones lie unmarked, their stories footnotes in other men's glory. The queen who overthrew him is remembered not as a liberator, but as a woman led astray by love. Her fury recast as seduction. Her agency erased, because history does not like loud women, and it does not like shameful kings, so it polishes. It buries. It chooses what to echo and what to silence. Edward II is now studied with detachment, a curiosity, a monarch who failed, a man caught in the tides of political drama. The fire that licked at his name is now just ash beneath footnotes. The pain he left behind, stripped of voice, but scars do not vanish. They sink. In the quiet corridors of inheritance, something remained. A lesson, never spoken aloud, passed through narrowed glances and whispered oaths. that a crown does not make a man holy, that royal blood can rot. That obedience is not always sacred, yet even now his legacy clings not in law, but in the ease with which cruelty was disguised as ceremony. He was crowned with fanfare, draped in silk, called Your Grace by men who hated him. And when he fell, he did not answer to the mothers he broke or the homes he shattered. He answered only to men like himself. And even they, in the end, looked away. That is the quiet horror. Not that he ruled badly, but that he ruled with impunity and was mourned by none. And still he rests in stone, while the women taken, the nobles crushed, the queen betrayed, remain scattered in the dust, their names cracked from memory. This was not one man's tragedy. It was a kingdom's confession, unspoken, unatoned, and if you listen closely, beneath the hymns, beneath the polished plaques and royal seals, you may still hear it. Not justice, not grief, but the sound of a stolen crown, still echoing in the hollow it left behind.